Hiram, if you're
say the hey you.
okay. Thanks. I mean, I think they're already AU.
Yes,
but
yeah. Okay. Well, you're here to hear from people about wildfire protection, and not from me. So I'm just going to call on Marlita Reddy-Hjelmfelt, who is a member of this congregation and worked a long time now on fire issues. And we're very pleased that Brian Williams, emergency preparation person for the city of Santa Fe, is joining us as well.
So, hi, as he said, I'm Marlita Reddy-Hjelmfelt, and I know a bunch of you. They asked me to come over and do this wildland fire preparedness talk because I have been working as a volunteer at first and now work for the Forest Service in the summers, but actually as response. So when we have these type 1 fires, which is the kind we have going on all over northern New Mexico, my job has been to monitor social media during those fires and collect up people's concerns. And something that I have seen over the years, I've done this for 12 years now, is people really don't understand where to get their information. And unfortunately, people around town who I know what I do, and so they'll call me and say, hey Mar, what's that smoke plume? Not my job. I usually know, and I'll call Brian, or I'll call Porfirio, who some of you might remember I brought from Wildland Urban Interface for the city. So I like to tell people I don't know a lot, but I know how to find out stuff. And that's what I want you guys to know. So you're not calling me or calling a friend or looking on social media to get all of your stuff. I mean, there are official pages, and Santa Fe Emergency Management has one, although I don't know how updated it is. So, but the one big place to look, if you can remember this, is nmfireinfo.com. That is everything for wildfires. They'll tell you which fires are going. There, I'm sure, is a link to get on mailing lists. If you're not like a social media person, you don't want to keep up with it, you can get alerts from there. And the other big thing, you'll have to Google it because I think it's a long URL, is sign up for Alert Santa Fe. And just Google it and you'll find it, and it will have instructions for getting alerts. You can get them to your text. You can get emails, and there's different kinds. It's not just wildfire. So if there's a water main break and it blocks off roads, if there's a traffic investigation, those kinds of things you can sign up for. Say, I don't want one every 15 minutes for a blocked road. But definitely it will have your evacuations, etc. And I'm going to introduce Brian in a sec, but while I do that, I have two things that fell apart. that you can actually acquire for yourself, which I really like having around. This white one is a weather alert radio, and it lets you program in where you are, and it'll give you alerts just for there. I'll tell you, sometimes they can be annoying. Like Eric and I get flood warnings, and we're at the top of this big hill. We're not gonna have a flood, but it's, you know, it's area based. So this is a really great thing to have, and it plugs in, and there's also batteries in the back. And this is an emergency radio. This has a weather band on it, an AM and FM. It can run on batteries, it charges, so you can keep it charged that way. And worst case scenario, there's a hand crank, so you can charge it up. And these newer ones, they cost like $30. There's a flashlight. If you're out camping and you run into an emergency, please don't long press this button when you're looking at it. That'll start a little siren. So it's a really handy thing to have. There's a really strong flashlight on it. Don't look this way when you press the light button at the top. So there are my few little tiny tips. And now the person you really came to hear. This is Brian Williams. He is currently the Emergency Management Director for the City of Santa Fe Emergency Management. Did I get all that in right?
Close enough for government work.
Speaking of government work, he was formerly the recovery officer for New Mexico Homeland Security and Emergency Management. I know I got that one right because I volunteered there. And he was, if I'm not mistaken, a wildland firefighter before doing all this. So he's going to give you the real scoop on how to be prepared for wildland fires. Take it.
Good morning. I'm glad you're all here. I will tell you right up front, I opted not to do death by PowerPoint. I hope that's okay with folks. If there's some information, we have some website addresses. I hope it might not be that readable from a distance. But you know, if there's something we need to put up on the board, I'll go ahead and do that. So as Mar pointed out, I am the emergency manager for the city of Santa Fe. So what the heck is an emergency manager? My job is to be a concierge for public safety. I solve problems. I meet the needs. I work with the fire department, the police department, public works, on a variety of threats to the city. Our primary responsibilities in emergency management are the protection of life, property, the environment, and the economy of the city of Santa Fe. And we do that primarily with planning, with preparedness. We spend a lot of time garnering grant funding, which is used by, for example, our fire department. We get grant funding that helps them train the airport firefighters who have to both take a certification course, but every year have to go, I know I say have to, they get to go to Dallas, Fort Worth and burn up an airplane. And Dallas has one of the most premier aircraft firefighting facilities in the country. And so our guys get state-of-the-art training on how to deal with aircraft fire. Of course, lately, the threat is fire, and that's why you're all here. Has anyone here ever actually been through a fire, a wildland fire? If you don't mind my asking, where? Here in New Mexico?
I was a lieutenant in New York City Fire Department.
Okay, did you do wildland fire? Not much, yeah.
Pretty close,
But Central Park could have a big wildfire there. Anyone else? No one is? As Mark pointed out in a previous job iteration, I was the disaster recovery manager for the state of New Mexico, which meant I was responsible for putting together As you may know, the governor just requested and received a presidential disaster declaration. It was my job to prepare the letter. My job included gathering the information that supported that request, and that included damage assessment. So I've probably witnessed close to 1,000 destroyed structures over my 10 years with Homeland Security and Emergency Management, in addition to my work as a wildland firefighter prior to that. One of the more fascinating things about fire is that you'll have a house that is completely destroyed and the house next door isn't touched. Some of it's the luck of the draw, the luck of wind. Often, and more often than not, it's because they took steps to protect their property. So as you look at, just curious again, how many folks live in the forest or live in a woodsy area? Not a one? Well, one of the things you can do when facing the threat of wildfire is take a look at your property and ask yourself, if you were a firefighter, would you be able to protect it? And that's one of the things that the fire department, in fact, our fire department is engaged in right now. We have a task force up in Pecos, and they are doing structure protection. And amongst the tasks that they're accomplishing is structural triage. That means they go to a property and they look at it and they ask themselves, can we protect this property? If the property is thick with dead wood and there's a pile of firewood next to the structure and a garage full of gasoline and chemicals and herbicides and what have you, no. Firefighters are not going to die to save your house. However, if you take steps to mitigate the threats at your house, the hazards at your house, moving the firewood away from the building, I strongly recommend, and this is something, regardless of whether you're in the woodland or in an urban setting, if you have a lot of chemicals, household chemicals in your garage, use them up, get rid of them. If you don't need it, don't keep years old herbicides and years old, you'd be surprised how dangerous that circumstance can be for firefighters. When a whole bunch of houses start burning up, the fumes, and keep in mind, wildland firefighters do not have self-contained breathing apparatus. They don't have air tanks. So whatever is in the smoke in the area can hurt them. And oftentimes garages have a litany of things that are, you know, everybody I don't know, everybody saves stuff for years. They hate to throw it out. By the way, the best way to dispose of a hazardous material is to use it for whatever its purpose. So if it's an herbicide, kill the weeds. If it's an insecticide, kill the insects. If it's some other chemical, gasoline, use it in your motors. But don't stockpile this stuff if you don't need it. We do, I believe, have through solid waste a hazardous materials disposal capability so that you can take it and dispose of it at the landfill properly. When you're faced with wildland threat, Mara had pointed this out, and I will underscore this, Alert Santa Fe. But Alert Santa Fe is more than just an alert system. It's also smart 911. What does that mean? That means that you can put your information, if you have a heart condition, if you're oxygen dependent, if you have a mobility problem, whatever those particular things are, you can put into the 911 system and it will pop up whenever there's a 911 call at your address. And by the way, folks like myself can cull that database. In other words, I can go in and I can say, tell me where everybody that is homebound. We did this for COVID. We identified, or in part, using Smart 911, folks that were homebound. And that enabled us to reach out to folks so that we could get folks vaccinated at home. So if you have issues, pets, whatever it is, you can, whatever is important or you think might be important for 911 to know, you can input that information into Smart 911. And as Mark pointed out, you can opt in to various notification lists, fire, traffic accidents, et cetera, et cetera. Now, by the way, in the event of a major incident, you do not have to opt in for evacuation. We have the ability, I think everybody here has probably had an emergency alert on their television. We have a capacity to do the same through the cell system, through what's called iPause. So we can send out, we, the city, the state, the county, can send out an emergency message to every cell phone in a geographic area. The county, the city, the entire state if needs be, depending on the nature of the emergency. So you don't have to opt in to get an evacuation notice. It will be forced to your phone. It will be forced to your television. The 911 or the emergency alert system literally takes over your television. You can't even change the channel. I don't know if you ever noticed that. But when an emergency alert is activated, you can't change the channel until the alert is complete. So we have capabilities, but we also have some limits. And right now, to some degree, New Mexico, the Southwest, has an advantage in that our fire season starts sooner than everybody else's. I know that's, don't laugh at it. The reason that's an advantage is that right now, there's a tremendous amount of resources available for wildland firefighting. Airplanes, helicopters, hand crews, tankers, engines. A lot of that resource is available this time of year. A month and a half from now, 2 months from now, they are going to be tied up all over the West. In not only, fortunately in the Southwest, we have monsoon, so our fire season wanes in July, and you start to see Colorado and Wyoming and Utah and Montana and Idaho burning at the same time. So in a sense, we're to some degree advantaged by the fact that our fire season starts 2 months sooner than everybody else's. This, in fact, I hate to say it, but the word fire season is almost meaningless now. Normally, we would call fire season from basically June into July, into monsoon. To see the size and ferocity of fire that we're seeing now in May, in April, is turned basically the word season on its head. This is unprecedented. I hate to say, but it's probably going to become the new normal. As we are facing, as you know, or many of you know, we've been facing historic drought. Most of the state of New Mexico is in exceptional or extreme drought. With that, fire is inevitable. Tragically, the largest fire now in state history, which was a combination of 2 fires, was the result of an escaped prescription burn and a pile burn. Believe it or not, the pile burn was done in January. That pile burn smoldered, hidden under the ground for months. And then the wind came along, blew it, blew embers into the wildland, and the next thing you know, we have a big fire. And in this case, 2 fires came together to create what is now the largest fire in state history. Anybody know how big it is off the top of your head? It's about 315,000 acres. Its predecessor, which was the Whitewater Baldy Fire down in Catron County, was 289,000 acres. That's enormous. That's like the size of the state of Delaware. I mean, people, to get your head wrapped around how much area has burned. Now keep in mind, it isn't the entire landscape burned to a moonscape through 300,000 acres. It's mosaicked. Some areas burned more than others. But the reality is that this is sadly likely to be the new normal. So what can you do? Now, as I had asked, most of you don't live in the wildland interface. So what can you do to help those that do? Well, let's start with write your congressman. What are you going to tell them? We need more aircraft. In 2002, there were 2 separate incidents involving Forest Service aircraft where the wings broke off of the airplane. Yes. One of the things that happens in wildland firefighting is that they use surplus military aircraft. The problem with that is that unlike commercial aircraft, they don't keep really good records of hard landings and steep turns and things that bend the wings or do damage to the aircraft. It's military. It's Top Gun. They fly like crazy. These aircraft ended up in the fire fleet, and it turned out they broke. The Forest Service grounded, and the NTSB grounded the entire fleet. Of that, less than half were approved for use beyond 2002. The NTSB basically told the Forest Service, we cannot tell you these aircraft are airworthy. There's no history. That doesn't mean they're junk, but there was no history on the aircraft. And as a result, they couldn't validate that these aircraft were airworthy. And so we lost about half of the initial attack aviation fleet. And a lot of people don't realize the greatest value of aircraft in wildland fire is not when the fire is 300,000 acres. It's when it's 10 acres or 2 acres. So we call it initial attack aircraft. The idea being is that if we can get aircraft in there and suppress the flames, that enables the hand crews to get in and put fire line around the fire. It's invaluable in terms of protecting us here in the West. We do have an advantage now that there are companies that have developed what are called very large air tankers. You might have seen on the television, DC-10s, 747. In fact, I believe several of them are based right here in Albuquerque. But there's not enough. The total, I'll be honest with you, they keep it kind of hush-hush. But the total number of aircraft, of initial attack aircraft, in my opinion, is woeful. It should be, in 2002, it should have been twice the number that they had at the time, and we lost half of them. So we're probably, 70% below what we should have. And if we're starting to see this kind of fire activity in April, we need more aviation. Type 1 helicopters, big helicopters that can drop a snorkel into a lake or a pool and drop 1,000 gallons of water on a burning fire that's a quarter acre or an acre before it turns into a 300,000 acre monstrosity. Unfortunately, nature works against us. The very thing that pushes the fire and makes it worse, the wind, also prevents us from using aviation. And this has been a challenge that we faced with the fires we have today, is that right when we needed it most, the winds were ferocious and they couldn't fly it. Fortunately, we had a few days which enabled for the Sierra Pilata fire down the one by Los Alamos, we had some calm enough wind. They were able to really hit it hard with aircraft and manage to suppress it to the point where the fire is now basically under control. It's not completely contained, it's not completely under control, but it's certainly no longer the imminent threat of burning down Los Alamos that it was in the days prior. Same thing with the monster fire up in Las Vegas. Fortunately for us, the winds have been favorable. So what's happening right now, today, we're having a wind event. But the wind is blowing the fire towards itself, which is a huge advantage for us. The other day, it was much worse, where the wind, folks probably know a lot about weather, the term backdoor cold front. A cold front passed through northern New Mexico, and what that did is it shifted the wind to the east. In other words, it was coming from the east, pushing the fire to the west. That meant the fire was being pushed towards Pecos. Fortunately, it did not make a run on Pecos. The wind wasn't as strong as it was expected to be, and they had favorable conditions with the high or low temperatures, high humidities that enabled them to keep the fire from spreading as much. What's making it tough is that western side of the fire it's wilderness. And so building fire line, it's not as easy. It's not like you can just put a dozer out there that they did on the eastern side of the fire. Lots of dozer line on that fire. They couldn't do that. So it's hand crews. And unfortunately, hand crews don't move as fast or as furiously as a bulldozer. But we're looking at, it appears that the conditions have been sufficiently favorable that we're not anticipating that fire to run again, which is good news. The role the city of Santa Fe has played in this is, number one, we have a shelter. That shelter is at the Chavez Center. It's intended to be available for overflow. For those of you who don't know, the church camp in Glorieta was gracious enough to provide sheltering. At its peak, there were 730 people in that shelter. Yeah, about 250 were from the college. So that number is down to below 10. And in fact, it closed yesterday. We did not see folks in our shelter. Knock on wood, people had somewhere to go. In addition to providing sheltering, we have provided our fire department has sent a task force. We sent one to Vegas and now to Pecos. It is our wildland fire crew, but also structural protection engines. So the intent of this particular task force is structure protection. So they'll go in, they'll look at structures, they triage. And like I said, they're gonna look at your property and they're gonna make a decision. Can we save it? Or is it even possible for us to defend it? And that decision is made primarily with the interests of the firefighters. We don't want to endanger their lives to protect a house. Don't get me wrong, your house is valuable. We know that. But it's not as valuable as the lives of firefighters. So the kinds of things that you can do to protect your structure, since no one here's saying they've got a woodsy structure, maybe we can just kind of gloss through this, but basically clear out the dead wood, clear out fuel around your structure, close off spaces where if there was fire and blowing fire, that embers could not, like for example, blow in under your porch to the pine needles under your porch or in through the vent on your roof. I've dealt with a fire in Idaho where the guy had a pile of firewood right next to his house. Lucky him, his neighbor had a tiny little bulldozer. And I got to admit, I thought it was so impressive. His neighbor came and pushed the wood pile away from the house and saved his house. Probably not that many people have a bulldozer handy to push the wood away, but it was impressive. But those are the kinds of steps that you can take, and frankly, you could take that similar kinds of steps to protect your home from just general fire, structural fire. You know, you don't want to have a lot of flammable things if you don't need them. You want to take steps to protect your house. In my world, I think about, I'm the guy you don't want to invite to dinner to talk shop. I will scare the bejeebus out of you. If you really knew what was in my head about the bad things that can happen. And I think, I frankly, that's what they pay me for. I will be honest with you, the thing that scares me the most is a massive solar storm. The kind that could take out the electrical grid, not just of the United States, but of the whole freaking planet. Imagine what you would be like if we had no electricity and no likelihood of having electricity for who knows how long. Because at that point, you would have, where do we get transformers? South Korea. Where are they going to get the fuel for the ships to get the ships here to the United States, let alone the fuel to run the trains to move the transformers? This is something that just literally scares the heck out of me. Of course, there are things, in the big spectrum of threats, there are Earth-ending threats, which of course, not much we're going to do if a giant meteor is hitting for us. What scares me about solar events is that it won't destroy the Earth. It'll destroy the things that we have become so dependent upon. Electricity, cell phones, radio communication, you name it. It'll all be gone.
Trash the radio station.
So, I've babbled a little bit. I want to engage you folks in an opportunity to ask questions, and let's talk about this.
I have a question. Suppose you talked about Los Alamos being threatened by fire, and I know that in a previous fire in the early 2000s, a number of homes burned in Los Alamos.
Mm-hmm.
Suppose a fire starts here on the mountain, on Santa Fe side. What are the chances that the more urban part of Santa Fe gets threatened?
Depends on how strong the wind is blowing. Right. She's asking about if there were fire to start in the wildland interface, what's the likelihood, and tell me if I'm wrong, what's the likelihood that it might get into the urban area? And the answer is it depends on how ferocious the wind is. Folks, I suspect you're familiar with the town of Paradise. If you're not, and you're really serious about learning the reality of wildland fire, I urge you to go to, it's Butte County, California. And their emergency management office has put together some YouTube videos of various different people the fire chief, the emergency manager, the city manager, talking about what happened in the campfire. One of the sort of the common theme, the common message from all of these individuals who lived through this extraordinary fire was, think about the worst case scenario, it's going to be 10 times worse. And the campfire, for those of you that, is anybody that doesn't know the campfire? This fire was horrific. It killed hundreds. It burned over an entire town. Virtually every structure in the town, save for just a handful, were destroyed. Could that happen here? Possibly. There's some things that make us less likely to, we don't have quite as volatile fuel that they do here in Santa Fe that they do in California. We don't anticipate that sort of ferocious downslope wind, but it's possible. You know, once fire starts to get into an urban area, particularly things like gas stations and other areas that have a high fuel load, then it could become a conflagration. And then it's just, then really it's just sheer luck that the fire would stop at, say, a roadway or some other, you know, and it would be a huge challenge for our fire department. Let's hope it doesn't happen.
It seems like wind is really one of the biggest deterring factors about the frost. I mean, we have friends at a place in Boulder, and he said, you know, there was this huge area of just concrete plazas and stuff. There's nothing that seemed to want, you know, that would ignite fire. And embers would you know, come from a mile away across all of this concrete and then just ignite these homes. I mean, seems like the wind is really the crucial.
We call it spotting. When a fire, the potential for spotting is measured in miles. And normally well, there's really no such thing as an average fire, but you're looking at quarter to half mile spotting. That's what we've seen up here, is, you know, in the quarter to half mile. You start getting these hurricane strength winds, and you can have, when you start having mile plus spotting, in other words, you've got the front of the fire and then embers are being thrown out in front of the fire a mile and starting new fires. Spot fires is what we call them. That can become an enormous challenge for fire crews, because obviously you don't want to get caught between a fire front and spot fire, which means you're going to pull the crews away. And if the winds are that ferocious, you're not flying helicopters and planes. Sir?
We don't have a lot of trees out in Eldorado, but we have an enormous amount of dry grass. What can we do about that?
It's, I mean, I hate to say it, burn it.
It's huge. We mowed around our house, but the green belts and stuff are brown.
Well, one of the things you have going in your favor is that the length of the flame in a fire is proportionate to the height of the fuel. So if you got a 1-inch blade of grass, it's going to produce a 1-inch flame. You got a 100-foot tree, you could get 100-foot flame. So trimming the grass reduces the fuel, the flame length, which reduces the potential for it to impinge on structure. And frankly, grass fire burns so fast that often you're able to burn it. It will burn right past your structure. So in your case, perhaps the way to protect your structure is to have a non-flammable barrier. Maybe it's crushed granite or some other stonework that you've created a buffer, a moat, basically, an that's the right word, non-flammable barrier to reduce the potential for that small amount of flame to ignite. And remember that it's also moisture. Just out of curiosity, how many people here, if they saw a fire, would hose their house? Okay. Now, we in the service don't promote that for a variety of reasons, but here's my advice. Add soap. Right? What do you mean, soap? Well, why? The reason is simple. Water is strongly attracted to itself. So if you're hosing the water on your roof, which can be a good thing, or your porch, or your fence, in clean water, most of that water is just glomming to itself and rolling right off. Whereas if you add soap, and that's any kind of soap, laundry detergent, dish soap, you name it, anything, it's what's called a surfactant. What that does is number one, it defeats the attraction of the water to itself, and here's the kicker that's really good. It makes it carbon seeking. So instead of the water running off your roof, it now wants to glom onto the carbon. That would be the wood. And if you can get it to foam up and fluffy up, all the better. That just means that the water is going to have a greater advantage to soak in to your shingles or your wood on your porch. Simple as it sounds, it makes a huge difference. Like without soap, over 70% of the water is just going to run off your roof. You're just wasting the water, which, by the way, is why we don't promote it. When I say we, the fire service, emergency management, there's also the disadvantage of putting pressure on the water system. You know, if the fire department's trying to use the fire hydrants and everybody on the streets using their hose, that's a challenge. But at the same time, people have a right to protect their own property. And that's something that they do. It's just logical. They're going to do what they can to save their property. This is a way for you to maximize that effort. We don't advertise it because we don't want to promote people using water in the first place. But I'm telling you, keep it here in the church. More questions? Sir?
Quick one. You don't have any role in an active shooter situation?
Do I go after active shooters? No. I work on things like mass casualty preparedness. And for example, at the City of Santa Fe, we are promoting training for all city employees are now required to take active shooter training and to capture that they in fact did the training. I work with the police department primarily with providing grant funding to support the SWAT team. So for example, right now I'm working on a grant application to replace our Bearcat. The Bearcat is an armored car. Our armored car is getting old. It's starting to need a lot of service. We did have, there is a program, many of you may have heard about it. It got a horrific black eye after the Ferguson riots, but it's called the 1033 program. As you can imagine, there is tons of military surplus. tons. There are thousands of tens of thousands of Humvees, thousands of MRAPs. MRAP is a mine-resistant armored personnel carrier. It's basically military version of a Bearcat. We had one. We had a Humvee too. One of the city councilors is very adamant about the appearance of the militarization of the police and forced us to get rid of it. It's unfortunate because that was our backup for our Bearcat. I see things both ways. We don't want our communities to be armed encampments. We don't want to feel like if people are protesting that they would be subjected to, and most of us have gray hair or nearly gray hair, so most of us maybe remember in our youth what happened in many of the towns here in the United States. The fire hoses and the dogs and the police beating people with batons. We don't want that. We don't want that in Santa Fe. Unfortunately, the reality is there are bad people out there. And those bad people can do very bad things. When you say active shooter, what are you going to do? I mean, if you had an active shooter, let's say perched in a building, shooting at the plaza, how are you going to protect people? One of the tools that we have is, in order for us to be able to engage an active shooter, we have to protect the police so they can shoot back. And armored vehicles is how we do that. The days of Adam 12 and hiding behind your car door are over. This is the phone I can't turn off. Sir.
How far should the wood pile be from the structure?
Far enough that the flames of imagine the wood pile on fire. How big would those flames be? Probably, depending on how dry the wood is, it could be tens of feet. I would say at least 20 feet.
Just a tip for you to look into it further. There is a concept called home ignition zone. And if you go look for that, you're going to find how to firewise your property. I get paranoid about fire. It's one of my worst fears. So if there's like a red flag warning that you see happening, Eric and I actually pull our cushions off our deck furniture and just toss them inside. Because you don't want something flammable sitting next to your house. We replaced our wood deck, which is a little more expensive than other things we did, but we replaced it with bamboo composite.
I'm sorry, you can't leave.
So, yeah, go look up either home ignition zone or firewise suppressor, and you will find a whole lot of detail on what Brian suggested about living control in the house.
I mean, there really is no shortage of information. Yes, sir.
I see, unless I'm mistaken, that you had several thousand firefighters on the fire scene.
Just over 3,000.
Will they be leaving when their season starts?
No. They will leave when they're not needed. It's a secondary subject. Many of you may not know that prior to 1968, the U.S. Army had the responsibility for fire suppression in national parks. In the early days of Yellowstone, it was the Army. And oh, by the way, there was a time when they would put a barricade, an A-frame barricade out in the middle of the road that said, "Stop fire," and they could conscribe you. You could be literally stopped on the road and handed a shovel and told to go fight fire. In 1968, and by the way, up until 1968, by an act of Congress, forestry was required to be taught at West Point. In 1968, the U.S. Forest Service, in combination with other land management agencies, created what was then called the Boise Interagency Fire Center, which is now the National Interagency Fire Center, which serves as the logistics and coordinating hub for firefighting, wildland firefighting nationally. The country is divided into what we call geographic coordination areas. We're in the Southwest, which is basically New Mexico and Arizona. I think they just modified the boundary. There was a little sliver of Texas that was in the Southwest and a little sliver of Oklahoma. The geographic areas are smaller in the West. The East is pretty much everything in the Southeast is one giant coordination area. Why? Because they don't have as much fire. California has two, because they have a lot of fire. The way this works is that, and one of the themes of emergency management is all disaster is local. In fact, all incidents, however ginormous, begin and end at a single resource. Every forest fire starts in a forest district, and there is an entity responsible for responding to that fire, whether it's a Forest Service or a county or the state or the city. There is a jurisdiction that is the principal jurisdiction. No matter how big, and in this case, 3,000 firefighters, eventually this fire will roll back to the responsibility for its respective forest district. Fires are managed by incredible professionals. There is an extraordinary amount of thought that goes in every single day. They're looking at what's our fire conditions, active fires, what's our fire risk in terms of the potential for new fires, what do we need for resources? And that is determined geographically throughout the country. And those decisions are weighed depending on factors like, for example, the threat to life and property. This fire happens to have a high threat for life and property. Therefore, it is the #1 fire in the country. It doesn't matter how big it is, although typically big fires are big threats. A fire can be enormous and not be the priority fire simply because it's burning forest. And so the disposition of resources is made at a regional level. It can also be made, we have what's called the incident command system. We type resources. Type 1 is the most sophisticated. So, for example, there are 2 type 1 zones in this fire. They could bring in an additional team called an area command. That area command would make the decisions. In effect, they come in and they make the decisions about who gets what resources for that constellation of fire. So if you have a lot of competition for resources, they have a mechanism to formally evaluate. I mean, face it, every firefighter is going to want all the planes. You know, I'm focused on the fire that I have to fight. So I'm going to ask for 6 planes. There may not be 6 planes available. There may only be 4. somehow, and there is a very formal, well-established, well-structured process to decide who gets those planes. And it applies to everything. Planes, hand crews, engines, you name it. Sadly, and I gotta tell you, I don't understand why we're having such a hard time finding people to work. But right now, the city of Santa Fe can't staff their 20-person hand crew because there's not enough applicants. Go figure. Where are people working? I don't know.
I'd like to add something to this as far as resources going across, because if you're just driving down the road here, you will notice Navajo hot shots are here. You'll notice people from Boise. We have people from Arizona in here. One of the Type 1 teams is from California. There's only, I think, 16 now Type 1 incident management teams in the country. And it's not just the Southwest teams here. We have a California team here. There are two Southwest teams that are switching off on our big fire. When our season starts winding down, please, Lord, let it wind down, they're going to go up to the northwest. The fire season up there starts right as ours starts winding down.
Mm-hmm.
And because California was way ahead of the times and had the fire season, they were all over there. We have actually, I think, 3 zones on this fire.
My understanding was they've shifted from the east, west, and went north, south.
Yeah, but it was
3, yes.
It's not the first time. If you remember 2 years ago, the August complex out in California was something like 38 square miles for that fire. There were 4 Type 1 teams that were on that fire in zones just like ours. They get 2 days off in between and then have to go to another one. So when you see a firefighter, thank them. Our firefighters don't just fight wildland fires here. They get their rest and they go to another one.
And pray for rain in July.
Well, floods, but yes.
As the disaster recovery manager, one of the things I've dealt with 10 major disaster declarations. Those are presidential disaster declarations. About half of them were for post-fire flooding. It's a horrific problem in the Southwest. I don't know how many of you ever saw Santa Clara Canyon. If you did before it burned, you don't want to see it now. The erosion that's occurred, I mean, I've been up there 5 times since the fire, and what started as maybe an incision, maybe this deep, is now deeper than I am tall. It just, you have to see it to believe it. It's just extraordinary what the damage that can be done. Okay, so I'm going to use a dirty word. Prescription burn. Generally, prescription burning does not prevent a fire from happening. What it does is it prevents it from being as hot and as ferocious. When fires burn really hot, it chemically destroys the soil, and it will change the chemistry such that the soil becomes what we call hydrophobic. What was once dirt that would soak up water now has the runoff rate of blacktop. The runoff rates in Santa Clara Canyon increased 20-fold from what they were pre-fire. With natural disasters, you got to see it to believe it. It's just amazing what nature does. The flooding in Santa Clara moved rocks the size of cars with ease. It moved rocks the size of cars. Imagine that. Rocks floating. More questions? Again, I'm the guy, you don't want me talking shop over dinner. It'll spoil your appetite. I've been,
I want to pick up on Linda's question about grassland fires. What Santa Fe has a lot of are arroyos. And they could be like channels of fire because the neighborhoods are built usually bordering.
you know what the big problem is right now? Somebody is deliberately starting fires. We've had several in the last few weeks at about 1 o'clock in the morning in various locations. We've had 4 homeless encampment fires. One of the things that I'm doing, I'm in the process of purchasing little single-use, basically hairspray can fire extinguishers that we'll dole out to the homeless folks. So that if by chance they start their tent on fire or start their sleeping bag on fire, they can mitigate it to keep it from spreading into a neighborhood. But right now, apparently there is someone, we haven't identified it as, I mean, we've had some encampment fires, but this is different. This is somebody is deliberately starting fire. I know, it's about 1 o'clock in the morning. It's been a consistent problem now for a few weeks. We don't know who. It's frightening that there are people whose minds are so bent that they feel like they need to do something like that for whatever satisfaction they get. It's just, we're lucky. We have a good fire department. They have a good response rate. But, and fortunately, they're not doing it in the forest. They're doing it in the urban areas, Siringo and St. Francis. Fortunately. If someone really put thought into it, they could cause some real havoc. When I was wildland firefighting, there was a rumor. It was taken very seriously because in the Al-Qaeda, I bet you didn't know that, or maybe you did know. Some people don't, nobody knows. I sounded like somebody I didn't want to sound like. There is actually an Al-Qaeda newsletter. They, forget the name of it, but basically it's an informational magazine for terrorists. And included in that was an article about how to start fire in the forest using the timers from washing machines. Scared the hell out of the fire community. Fortunately, we didn't see that happen, but that's a possibility. If somebody were knowledgeable and put thought into it, they could start a fire that we would have great difficulty getting a handle on quickly, particularly if it was somebody with fire experience. So fortunately, that hasn't happened. Have I scared you enough? My email address is here. It's BG Williams. That's, by the way, everybody in the city is their first initial, middle initial, last name. bgwilliams@santafenm.gov. If you have questions, send me an email. If you have concerns, let me know. Reach out to, I know the mayor, the city council really want to get a handle on this problem. It's a very serious problem. I hate to say it, but I think it's just really a matter of if, not if, but when, that we'll actually have fire in our forest here in Santa Fe. The question is, how big will it get? Let us hope that it doesn't turn into a 300,000 acre monster. Be on the lookout. Don't be afraid to, if you see a 3,000 foot column of smoke, chances are we already know about it. But if you're,
No one's gonna be mad at you if you call. I've done it.
don't hesitate. If you see smoke, for example, St. Francis. I was driving down St. Francis early in the morning and passed over the tunnel, and there was smoke coming out across the road. I would have called, except for I knew they were already on the way. Don't hesitate to call if you think something's suspicious. Better to be safe than to be sorry. And nobody will fault you. One of the things we've used the alert system for of late is to tell people, hey, you see this giant smoke column, we know. Please don't call 911. Right now, our 911 system is woefully understaffed. I mean, woefully understaffed. And so to bombard them with unnecessary calls just makes it that much more difficult. And so we want to try and be smart, but not overtax the system. So, I scared the hell out of everyone. If I've scared you, I've done my job, right? All right. Is that good?
Yes.
No death by PowerPoint? I've actually got my friend Yadi over at the house in the laundry, so I'm going over.
It looks like it was, yeah. The grass is like, it's like this.
Got it.
Brian, I wanted to share with Marlita that my husband flew story bombers, and after he left that business, his airplane was one that lost a wing. Yeah,
Lucky him.
yeah, really.
Yeah, it was so tragic.